Welcome to episode 7 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. My next guest is someone that went the opposite direction of many guests I've had and plan to have on this show. He started as an activist and advocate, and that led him into entrepreneurship. He's one of those selfless people that is always thinking of others, and it led him on a great path. Evan Nison is a drug policy reform advocate and founder of Nison Co, one of the biggest PR and SEO firms in the cannabis industry, and has founded other companies as well. Evan is the youngest member of the board of NORML and involved in a variety of other great organizations. I wish I could list them all here. Evan was the very first person I was introduced to in the cannabis industry when I started to explore the opportunities there about 7 years ago. Note that this was recorded in early September. Evan and I had a great talk about his journey. Here is Evan Nison on People Are the Answer. Evan, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. It's great to talk to you today, and I'm excited to have you on this podcast about people that are coming up with answers to the various issues that we have in the world. And, you came to mind early when I was coming up with this concept, having been one of the very first people I met in the cannabis industry when I got involved 6 or 7 years ago. And, I was hoping that you could just kind of tell us how you got where you are.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate it again. So I started in college as an advocate working on drug policy laws, including cannabis legalization, medical marijuana, because it was a pretty obvious need for me in terms of, or pretty obvious need to me. I was seeing my friends get arrested. I got drug tested myself in high school. I realized that cannabis itself isn't a big deal. Also, one of the things that made me realize is actually my economics class, which I can get into, showed me like the actual drug trade, like the economics of drug trade, and just made me realize that this was such an important issue that had so many different sort of limbs, and so many different intersections that I got involved working on drug policy at first in college. And then I worked my way up sort of the nonprofit advocacy ranks in the drug policy and cannabis legalization world. And then I used my skills that I learned there to start businesses that have similar missions to the nonprofits.
Love it. Yeah. I think that business is a very powerful vehicle for change, and you found that out. And, many entrepreneurs, myself included, get into politics as they learn about them through their business. But you were the opposite. Can you tell us a little bit more about how advocacy got you into business?
Yeah, a part of it was simply timing, right? I was in college and I didn't have as much of a need for money at the time. I was allowed to, I sort of had the freedom and flexibility to spend my time how I wanted, which was advocating. And I learned my skills there, like I said, including PR. Now my main company is a PR firm. And when I got out of college, obviously I needed money. And I also realized that the nonprofit model is not that effective, right? Going out and sort of begging for money and then spending it, and then begging for more money and then spending it is not as effective as having a sustainable business model built internally. So I realized, it made more sense for me to start a for-profit, but stay involved in nonprofits. And then coincidentally, that happened actually. I got hired. The way that it started is I got hired to lobby for a bill that I was supporting for free already, for legislative lobbying. And then I wound up sending that client so many reporters that they referred me to other clients. And that's how Nison Co, my PR firm, was built actually.
That's great. It's impressive how your advocacy sort of walked you into entrepreneurship, and how you've actually taken that opportunity and really executed on it. I imagine many people that come up more on the political science type side, at least in practice, might have some trouble monetizing their efforts. And I commend the way that you've been able to do it. And, can you talk about how your impactful missions for these businesses have allowed you to still focus on, the work that matters?
Yeah, I have a underlying top level mission statement that I try to um, do things that is encompassed within that, which is to build and maintain power, right? Or people don't like the word power, so social influence, but build and maintain social influence or power to change the things that I want to change, and then monetize that influence how I can ethically.
That's great.
So that's what we try to do. Not everything I do is perfectly within that, but I try to stick to that as much as possible, and then, build out a network of organizations and nonprofits and for profits with that in mind.
Got it. Well, normally this is the moment at which I'd ask a little bit more about your entrepreneurial journey, but I'm curious to go first into some of the advocacy work. Can you talk about just your journey through cannabis advocacy, and joining the board of NORML and all your work in New Jersey and elsewhere?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I mean, I think for a lot of us, it started initially, as a policy thing for sure, but also as sort of an anti-authority thing, right? So I graduated high school. I always thought since I was a child how cool it would be to like be involved in the lawmaking process, right? That was something I always thought would be very cool. Um, and after I graduated high school, I started smoking weed basically right afterwards. And when I was back for winter break for my after my first semester of college, I was on Wikipedia for my just looking at my hometown. It was probably high, honestly, just like looking online. And I saw that some towns in New Jersey have ballot initiatives. And previously, everyone said that the reason that New Jersey can't legalize cannabis or medical marijuana at the time was because they didn't have ballot initiatives. There was no ballot initiatives on the state level in most East Coast states. That's a West Coast thing for the most part, with some exceptions, obviously, like Massachusetts. And I found out, and I confirmed through my local city attorney that this was indeed true, that you can on the local level do this. So I decided I wanted to do it. I realized I needed about 700 valid signatures, and my graduating class was 750. So I was like, oh, I could just do cannabis and get all my my class to sign this, and we can stop arrest. Obviously, it was not that easy at all, but that's what started me on the path. So I started, basically that's what got me started was the local ballot initiative, which failed in both my town and the town next to me. It didn't fail to with the voters; it just failed to get on the ballot because of government, because of police and city council intimidation, basically, which I can get into. But that's what started me on the path and got me connected with NORML.
And just to
And
pause you
yeah,
there for a second, it's cool to hear, kind of the one of the entrepreneurial things I always share echoed in that instance, and that you learn as much or more from your failures than your successes. And I imagine you probably think that was the case in this instance.
oh yeah, for sure. I mean, this was such a successful failure, like in the sense that it got me going on this road. And the fact that I thought it was going to be easier than it was um, is probably the reason that I was willing to walk down that path. If I realized how difficult it would be, I may not have done it. Although I should have, but yeah, that's difficult. Um, so that connected me to NORML, and also SSDP, because SSDP saw me in an article about that and reached out. The article said that I was doing this in New Jersey, but I went to school in Ithaca, New York. So they reached out, and that's how I got involved or connected to both NORML and SSDP. And then I went out to California for an SSDP conference, my first SSDP conference ever, which is where I met the campaign manager for Prop 19, which was a California campaign in 2010 that was almost the first successful cannabis legalization campaign. I met him at that SSDP conference, and then they offered me, a job in quotes, like an internship basically, on that campaign. So I went out for the summer. I wound up taking a semester off of college to continue that campaign. We got 46.5% of the vote. But again, it was a failure, but it was a successful failure. Like when we started that campaign, we laid out in the very beginning that we would need at least $10 million to win. We probably won't be able to get $10 million. So our first goal was to win, but our second goal was to change the narrative of the conversation from if cannabis will become legal to when and how. And I do believe we succeeded in that. Like we were the first campaign to really start calling it cannabis, which we did because of message testing that we did, like actual legitimate message testing with focus groups and polling and all of that. And we put out what we called non-traditional allies in front of cameras, meaning cops, judges, mothers, people that you would not traditionally think as an ally to cannabis legalization, at least back then. And I think that we were able to successfully change the narrative around legalization, even though the ballot initiative didn't actually pass.
What you did there in terms of leveraging these, new assets, unused assets, untraditional people backing up this effort, you really innovated how cannabis advocacy was done.
Yeah, it was definitely a communications win for sure. And there was a lot of really, really smart communications people there, from traditional cannabis people like Tom Angel, and lots of SDPers and people from MPP who you obviously work with, and NORML, to just very smart political strategists from people that worked in White Houses and things like that. Just really, really smart politicos around the room talking about messaging. And we had the attention of the world, literally. I'm not exaggerating. Like on election night, there were international trucks with satellites backed up for blocks. We had a press conference the night of, I counted 30 something cameras from pretty much every country you could imagine. And we were able to get that message out, which I think was good. It failed, but in terms of being a ballot initiative, I think we succeeded in, like I said, that secondary goal. And then I was bummed about that because we lost. So when I went back to New York, I worked on the 9/11 Good Samaritan overdose prevention law, not cannabis related, but it was nice because it was a semi-easy win and it was an important law. And I got one of the Penns to sign that. And then, continued working in New Jersey and New York, politics and advocacy until today. Basically, that's the advocacy side.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And, we'd love to hear a little bit more about the entrepreneurial experience. You talked a bit about how your advocacy led you to start your PR firm, but, just tell me about Nison Co and what it is and how it's evolved.
Sure, yeah. So actually, technically, the entity itself, the first client I had was a political client, not cannabis related, and it was Death with Dignity, Aid in Dying for the Terminally Ill. And I managed that campaign first as a field organizer, and then eventually helped manage the campaign for a while in New Jersey. So that's actually technically the first client that the entity had. And then I was hired to lobby for a bill that I was supporting for free already, which is industrial hemp in New Jersey, which was technically the second client in that entity, but really the first, really what started Nison Co. So they hired me to lobby for a bill that I was supporting for free already, like I said, which was industrial hemp. Governor Christie, who's a total jackass for anyone who remembers him, vetoed it. We got it to his desk, and he, of course, vetoed it. But that client kept us around because we were getting so many media mentions for them as well. And then eventually we got PR tools, and our first 30 clients or so were all word, but just straight up word of mouth. Some of which I think actually came from you, probably. So thank you. And we basically built from there. We have a pro bono program where people can apply for pro bono assistance, which we do a lot of. We also have a new program where we hire formerly incarcerated people that we've been doing with Last Prisoner Project, and that's been going well. And then I expanded, the for-profit stuff I have a couple smoke and vape shops that I started with a friend of mine who went to jail for cannabis. So Nison Co's pro bono program has wound up doing some really cool stuff, including working with Ndaba Mandela, Nelson Mandela's grandson, on issues in South Africa, and lots of other cool things, including successful pardons, presidential pardons, and people currently helping promote people currently incarcerated. And we also do pro bono stuff for non-cannabis people that reach out to us, just like random nonprofits. So if you're a nonprofit, or just even a for-profit doing good work, but you can't afford PR, definitely feel free to apply on our website.
And that's NisonCo.com, right?
Yep. N is in Nancy, I, S is in Sam, O, N is in Nancy, CO like company.com.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I love the work that you guys are doing. I know you're helping some really great organizations and companies. And I can certainly endorse you guys as a client myself in various capacities. But now we've gotten through some of the day to day in terms of business and nonprofit and advocacy work. Tell me a little bit more about how you grew up and where you grow up, and how you really got the foundation for your work and your impact.
So I grew up in a pretty comfortable home. My dad helped bring a very popular stock chart to this part of the world. So there wasn't too much issue in terms of struggle, really, at all. I was definitely always anti-authority for sure, and my parents, super nice. They were never like pro cannabis or pro drug. But my parents, especially my dad, um, are very are pretty rational. So they are willing to be presented facts and arguments, which I think led to me sort of presenting cases a lot to try to get my way, if that makes sense. I My parents were also, I think, one of the reasons that I have been able to learn a lot about a lot of things is because they were very supportive of my random uh, ventures that I wanted to do, or hobbies, or things I wanted to learn. Like I was able to take flying lessons when I was a kid, and I set my basement up, which I'm actually standing in right now. When I was younger, it was like a recording studio when I got into recording music. So I was able to really like fully embrace all of my interests and hobbies, which I think um, has helped me in a lot of ways. I think also a pretty impactful part of my childhood was a camp that me and my cousin, who you also know, volunteered at in Maine. It was a camp for, I think it still operates actually, Camp Friendship. It was or is a camp for underprivileged people from Brooklyn who couldn't afford other camp. And we basically took them up to an island in Maine with no water, electricity. And I was just like the worker there. And that, yeah, I think the part of the initial push was my inkling for being, or my desire to be involved in policy, and the fact that I was anti-authority, and the fact that I knew that I'd be able to present a good case on this issue. Yeah, to
Yeah.
sum it up, basically.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I mean, we were both fortunate to have great parents. Not everyone is, and just hearing how supportive they were and how open-minded they were, I know that they pushed you to be the best that you can be and gave you those opportunities that you needed, and I think that's pretty incredible.
Very lucky. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of people out there that don't have great parents and they've found ways to persevere. But talking recently on the first episode with Alex Odera and Rocket Club, and he talked a bit about how parental mindset can be a big part of your child's future success, and so it's great to hear that echoed in a real world example.
Yeah, I was reading studies too that correlated your likelihood of being an activist with having a more intelligent father. So people with more intelligent fathers were more likely to be activists.
Interesting. So do you remember as a kid, like ever arguing for silly things that you wanted and like
Oh,
presenting
I'm
information?
sure. Oh yeah, I'd have to think a little bit more about it, but I'm totally sure. I mean, like I mentioned, this wasn't silly, but oh, actually, trampoline. I remember that. I don't remember how I did that, but I had to present an argument for that. That like talked about how it's not a hazard, all of that safety hazard, like countering those points. And like I mentioned, I took flying lessons when I was younger. I had like to put a whole PowerPoint presentation together on like the safety of airplanes and all of that before they would let me get in one.
I love it. That's a great way to do it.
Yeah.
I can certainly appreciate their valuing of safety, especially now that I have a son.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, you should take all this. I'm sure you are taking this into consideration.
I'm
Yeah.
definitely taking notes when I ask the questions about uh, people's parenting. So,
Yeah.
can you tell us a story of when you really saw how your work could affect change, or maybe an epiphany moment that helped you realize like this is important work?
Honestly, there's been a lot of them. Um, some of them were memorable, were not even necessarily cannabis related, like with the 9/1 Good Samaritan overdose prevention law. Like once we passed that, there was a few people that reached out to me saying they used that, which I thought was really cool. That was definitely very memorable and made me realize like, I think about these policies in my head like as um, almost theoretical things, but then they're actually used, obviously. Um, but when that's really made real by like people reaching out to me, um, that definitely strikes. Um, what else? I mean, the same thing with like pardons. Um, yeah, honestly, whenever you win and then that affects somebody's life, I think that to me has been really big. That's probably what comes to mind most for those.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine, obviously we're both cannabis activists and drug policy reform activists. And I know, like me, throughout that process, you've certainly met plenty of patients whose, quality of life, if not life as a whole, depend on their access to cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. And people who have benefited from the industry, they've gotten out of jail or they couldn't find jobs and they got money this way and they found a job this way. Um, yeah, there's a lot of really powerful stories because there's so much opportunity here that people are able to take advantage of. There's both sides of like the net positive, right? There's the harm that is being reduced or hopefully eliminated, and then the new opportunities from the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you embody something that I preach to fellow cannabis entrepreneurs is that, if you're involved in this industry, it's imperative that you're involved in advocacy and reform. The war on drugs has obviously done tremendous damage to a variety of communities. And, as people involved in the actual business in the legal space, I think that it's our responsibility to help get people like that out of jail and get their records expunged and make sure that they still have an opportunity in life, and that their lives don't stay ruined because the laws were wrong.
Totally. And I'll even add another like level to that. I think this is probably one of the biggest opportunities like for capitalism broadly to improve capitalism broadly by setting an example that exists really anywhere. This is a new industry that is born from a social movement with a lot of social equity components built in legislatively. And it could create, I hope it is creating, but it definitely could create, has the potential to create like a sort of shining star example for other industries too.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And, digging in on the industry a little bit more, um, I think you and I have both thought since the beginning that we were hoping this could be an industry that does set an example. And, you're one of those advocates that has also been involved in business. And, unfortunately, as the space starts to grow tremendously, we're just the people like us are a smaller portion of the pie in terms of who's involved. Do you have any concern about cannabis becoming too corporate and losing any of this? Or do you think that voices like ours are enough to keep it setting this example?
That's a good question, and I think time will be a big factor in that. Like, I think we can set it on the right course, if that makes sense. But sort of once it sets sail, it will inevitably get more and more corporate. Like, consolidation happens, and it gets more corporate by nature. Globalization is going to take effect. Um, but I think what we can do successfully, what I'm very confident we can do successfully, is get it on the right path and sort of push it in the right direction. And then that will, have ripple effects throughout the evolution of the industry towards our side. Um, but I would be lying if I said that I think it's going to be like exactly what I want from now until forever. Or
Yeah,
if it is, I mean, it's not even exactly what I want right now. So
of course. Yeah, I mean, we can do our best to set examples and to hope that we're ingraining organizations we're working with these values long term. But obviously, there's only so much we can do. But hopefully, many good players remain in the space.
yeah, and I'll also say for cannabis and every other industry, our generation, millennials and younger, are demanding this. Like, I think it's going to be very, very, very difficult to run a business that doesn't have some genuine social mission when our generation is like running everything and the main decision makers and have most of the wealth in the country. So, even if it's for self-preservation, I would say get on board because I think that this is
Yeah.
a trend that is not going to go away based on age demographics.
Right. And just for reference, when you say our generation, Evan and I are both in our 30s. Let's go a little bit more personal on the cannabis and the cannabis journey. I know that you're like me, someone that cannabis helps in a variety of ways. Would you just tell us about how you integrate cannabis into your life?
Sure. I mean, I use it on a very regular basis. Um, I coffee and cannabis are my two favorite drugs, I would say. And they've affected me on similar levels. I don't, I have a high enough tolerance that I don't really get stoned anymore. It's just a nice level of relaxation for me personally. It also has allowed me to like not drink at all, really. I may have a few drinks a year. I have no desire to drink, which I think is good. It's just my preferred drug, frankly. Like, it's kind of perfect. Like, I don't have to worry about it, or like there's a mental addiction you could kind of worry about, but um, there's a lot of things that I have some type of mental dependency on, including Facebook and my phone. And as long as it doesn't get out of hand, I'm fine with it. But not having to worry about overdose or drug interactions too much, or physical harmful effects. It's too many of them. It's pretty phenomenal, honestly. It impacts my life greatly. I will say that in many ways.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And Seth Rogen in his new book, Yearbook, he says something to the effect of some people need shoes to adapt to life and get around. Some people need cannabis to adapt to life and get around, is essentially what he was saying. And, I think that's certainly the case for some people. And whatever it may be that someone needs to adapt to life, as long as it's helping them and not hurting others, I think it's important for people to, not react to existing negative stigmas around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is just dealing with the reality. Right? I've often compared drug laws to sex laws. It feels good. People are going to do it. Drugs generally, right? How do you reduce the harms? And cannabis is the giant like solution to a good portion of that answer. Just because I'm not going to say it's harmless, but it's not harmful. It's somewhere in between. And I'm a drug policy advocate. I'm for full drug decriminalization, probably full legalization of drugs. But I will say cannabis is on its own level, obviously, of safety. Um, for sure. I'm not trying to stigmatize other drugs, but cannabis is just a safer drug. Like, it's just how it is. It's a fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly no reason it shouldn't be safe and regulated and tested. But we don't We could sit here all day and preach about the positives of cannabis since there's nobody here to argue with us. So we won't drone on
Right.
about that for too much longer. To switch back a little bit in terms of childhood and just impact in general, was, any experience from your childhood or, as you were growing up that showed you the importance of giving back, whether it was a situation where you were the giver or the receiver?
Yeah. That camp that I talked about, Camp Friendship, was definitely a big one. I, in my head, thought I understood what it was like being not be right, like growing up in what it might be like, I should say, growing up in Brooklyn, or in those types of, like a bad part of Brooklyn, or in poverty. Actually, uh, like having a lot of those personal stories um, in an environment like camp where you're bunking together and really getting to know everyone really, really well, was definitely seriously eye-opening for me in terms of, that's probably like where I started getting really the concept of privilege and understanding. I wasn't thinking about it in that, but with that word, but that's really where I started understanding, like, okay, like it's way easier for me than other people. Like I'm not just like, I'm not here because I'm like awesome. It's like, I was born into this situation, and they are just as smart, but they are in a shitty situation where they will, have a much more difficult time getting to even where I am now. Um, so that is definitely a big part. And then also just mentors that I've had have been a big, in terms of like being given something, like a mentorship is something huge. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am without the advice and guidance and door opening of mentors.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask if there's anyone that you consider a mentor, and it sounds like the case is yes.
Yeah, lots. The biggest that comes to mind is actually someone who isn't very similar to me, which is Rick Cusick, the former associate publisher of High Times. And we're very different in a lot of ways. Um, but he has taught me so much and opened up so many doors. He was actually the first person who who made me realize that the cannabis industry will exist. I remember when he told me in the High Times office, like, he's like, if we win, there's going to be an industry that needs to be created to serve us consumers, right? And I was like,
Was
holy
that
shit, you're
around
right.
the was that around the 2010 efforts?
That was probably like 20, like when I very first got involved, like 20, probably 2008, 2009, maybe. Um, so he's like, he literally was the person who made the light bulb go off in my head about the cannabis industry even existing in the first place. And we've sort of evolved together from there. Um, but I have other mentors too, but on the advocacy side, he's definitely been probably the biggest.
That's great to hear. I'm fortunate to have met Rick, and such an interesting, fascinating, empathetic guy. All right, so I have a question that I'm planning to ask every guest, and it's this: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
So I kind of have a couple answers to this. So the first thing, when I thought about this, the first thing I instinctively said in my head was poverty, because I think that's the worst thing happening in the world right now. That's equivalent to modern day slavery, I think, in terms of like how immoral it is, and how it should be like a major priority for everyone. But then when you said ripple effects, um, I think like people's understanding of other people in society um, is probably the root cause of a lot of things, including um, poverty not being prioritized like it should be. So I think that is probably what I would change, because it would have more ripple effects, including affecting poverty. And I probably should have mentioned earlier, but that's one of the things that I've tried to do with issues I've taken up, are things like cannabis, drug policy, death with dignity, things that make people think differently, um, with how you frame them, or things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer. Changing the way people think. Um, to me, that would probably do it. If logic ruled. Um,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's a very difficult thing to do, but we can find paths that start to carve our way there.
Yep. I don't know if everyone's going to ask you this, so if you already been asked this and the audience already got this answer, you could ignore it. But what about you?
You know, considering that I'm going to be asking everyone this question, I haven't really thought about it a ton from my perspective, but I also am kind of doing my own little study on this, right? And seeing what all of these smart people I'm talking to are saying, and perhaps forming my opinion from there. Um, I will say that I think something very macro, like you're saying, about changing the way people think would certainly be very valuable. But if you're going more specific, what you also said in terms of poverty, I think that people having what they need in order to function as the best
Yeah,
versions of themselves and take themselves out of that survivor mode is something that could be incredibly impactful on everyone. And some of that was stolen from what Alex Hodera said in his answer, but it definitely resonates with me.
for sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You could almost even weave the two together, because if people were able to not worry about, if people had what they needed and not worry about survival, then they would be able to think um, probably more empathetically.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Evan, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer. And it's been great talking with you, and look forward to future talks.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for having me. And if anybody wants to connect or thinks there's anything to collaborate on, I would be more than happy to schedule a call.
Yeah, and you can find more information on Evan and his businesses at NisonCo.com. That's NisonCo.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. To find out more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.